The .45 ACP was adopted by the United States military in 1906, first fielded in the M1911 pistol in 1911, and stayed in American service longer than any other pistol round in the country's history. Its origin isn't where most histories of the weapon start. It starts in a colonial jungle, with a sidearm that was failing at close range against an opponent the US Army hadn't planned to fight. And the specific tactical problem that failure created is the whole reason the .45 exists at all. The problem was close quarters stopping power. A Moro warrior hit 4 or 5 times in the chest with the Army's standard .38 caliber service ammunition, kept moving, kept closing, kept using the blade. Line officers in the Philippines wrote that down in dispatches. Medical officers confirmed it in post-combat examinations. The Army's formal investigation, which happened and which I'll walk through, reached the same conclusion. At the distances where the fight was actually happening, the service pistol was not ending engagements before the attacker reached the soldier. That mattered. That failure drove a chain of decisions, a new cartridge, a new pistol, a doctrine of close-range firepower that carried into 2 world wars, Korea and beyond. It also produced a reputation, started in the Philippines, hardened in the bocage of Normandy, sharpened in the cave systems of Peleliu, that the ballistics research of the last 40 years has never cleanly reconciled with the combat record. That gap between what the numbers say and what the men who carried the weapon believed is the part of this story I find hardest to talk about honestly. It's also the part most worth trying. The year was 1899. The Philippine-American War had begun, though nobody was calling it that yet. The United States, fresh off defeating Spain, had inherited a colonial archipelago it barely understood and was shipping troops there by the thousands. The weapon they carried was the new .38 caliber Colt revolver, the Army's latest sidearm. Smokeless powder, double action. On paper, a clear improvement over anything that had come before it. In the southern islands, Mindanao, the Sulu archipelago, the Army ran into something it had not planned for. A population of Muslim warriors the Spanish had fought without success for 3 centuries. The Moros. Their combat doctrine wasn't the one Western armies were trained to expect. It valued close engagement specifically. A smaller subset, known as juramentados, would take a formal vow of death before battle. They would bind their bodies with rope or leather to slow blood loss. They would shave their heads, they would fast, and then they would walk out of the tree line at a measured pace and come directly at an American line with a barong or a kris in each hand. A typical engagement ran like this: a sentry at dusk, hearing movement, turning, firing at a man already 20 yards out and closing. A center of mass hit from a service revolver should have ended the fight there. That is not what the reports describe. What the reports describe is Moro warriors hit 4, 5, 6 times with .38 caliber bullets, lungs perforated, rounds lodged near the spine, still moving, still closing. One case, later cited by the Army surgeon Louis Lagarde, shows this in unusual detail. A prisoner named Antonio Caspi attempted to escape on the island of Samar in October of 1905. Caspi was shot 4 times at close range with a regulation .38 Colt. 3 rounds hit him in the chest, perforating the lungs. 1 lodged near his back, 1 lodged in subcutaneous tissue. A 4th went through his right hand and out his forearm. He was stopped eventually by a blow to the forehead from the butt of a Springfield carbine. A careful reader should ask whether accounts like this were exaggerated. Men writing after close quarters fights tend to describe what happened in the strongest terms available, and that's a real problem for anyone trying to evaluate the record. What I find harder to dismiss is the consistency. The pattern shows up across multiple deployments, from line officers who had no contact with each other, with language that is nearly identical in dispatch after dispatch. The bullet will not stop a Moro, and the Army's formal response, reissuing obsolete single-action .45 revolvers under combat conditions, is not what an institution does when it's reacting to a handful of dramatic stories. That's what it does when it has absorbed something it can't ignore. The response itself is worth noting. The Army pulled old Colt single-action revolvers out of storage, a generational design, heavy, slow to reload, chambered in .45. A report attributed to General Leonard Wood, who commanded in the Philippines during that period, put the comparison in language that has never really been improved on. Natives shot several times with a .38 kept coming and cut up the man armed with it. The .45, he wrote, stopped a man in his tracks, usually knocking him down. That phrase, usually knocking him down, does a lot of work. It describes a specific operational outcome, a fight that ended before the attacker got close enough to use the blade. But everyone involved, from line officers to the War Department, understood the old Colts were triage, not a solution. The Army needed a new sidearm built around modern metallurgy, modern powder, and modern manufacturing. Before they could design one, they had to answer a question no one had formally asked. The question was how to measure stopping power. That sounds simpler than it is. A rifle you evaluate by range and accuracy. A machine gun by rate of fire and reliability. A sidearm, in 1904, was understood to be a last-ditch weapon, drawn when a fight had already closed to bad distance. The variable that actually mattered, whether the round would end the engagement before the other man reached you, was something almost nobody had tried to quantify. The test that finally did try is one of the strangest episodes in early American military research. It's worth describing honestly, weaknesses included. The task went to Colonel John T. Thompson, an ordnance officer with the infantry, and Major Louis Anatole Lagarde of the Army Medical Corps. Thompson's name would later be stamped on the most famous American submachine gun of the 20th century, which is not a coincidence. Lagarde was a surgeon. He understood wound ballistics from treating men who had been shot, not from theory. The pairing itself was thoughtful. An ordnance officer and a medical officer together, trying to answer what had always been treated as unanswerable. What they did was crude. There's no softer way to put it. They went to the Union stockyards in Chicago, the slaughterhouse complex where the United States in that era processed a significant fraction of its beef. Cadavers were suspended from ropes and hooks, then shot with different caliber rounds from varying distances. The sway of the body on the rope was measured on the theory that the body functioned as a rough ballistic pendulum and the swing would indicate the momentum each round carried. The cattle tests were worse. Animals were shot repeatedly, in some cases up to 10 times, and behavioral response was recorded. How quickly they went down, how much distress they showed, whether they kept moving. Historians have been hard on this methodology. They're right to be. Cadavers don't react like living tissue. Cattle aren't humans. Sample sizes were small. Results were variable enough that secondary sources disagree on the exact figures. Lagarde said 16 cattle and 2 horses were shot on the second day. At least one other source says 13 cattle. The methodology wouldn't pass a modern institutional review under any framework. The critique is valid. It also misses what Thompson and Lagarde were trying to do. They weren't producing publishable science. They were writing a specification. And the specification they wrote held up under combat conditions that would have embarrassed a lot of more rigorous studies. That's not a defense of the methodology. It's an observation about what happened afterward. What the results pointed to was consistent across both tests. Smaller calibers, .30 Luger, 9mm Parabellum, .38 Long Colt, produced less immediate effect. Animals often didn't drop until the 8th or 9th round. Larger calibers, .45, .455, .476, dropped animals by the 3rd or 4th. The report Thompson and Lagarde filed in mid-1904 contained a conclusion that has never really been rewritten. A bullet that will have the shock effect and stopping effect at short ranges necessary for a military pistol or revolver, they wrote, should have a caliber not less than .45. The Army took the report at face value and built its next pistol trial around it. The specification for the new service sidearm was fixed at a minimum of .45 caliber. That's where John Browning enters the story. Browning was, by 1904, the most important firearms designer in the English-speaking world. He had been working on an auto-loading pistol for Colt in .41 caliber, a round he thought was a reasonable compromise between size and control. When the Army's specification came down, he didn't argue. He scaled the round up. The case was redesigned. After a series of revisions involving Winchester repeating arms, Frankfurt Arsenal, and Union metallic cartridge, the final specification settled on a 230-grain bullet at a nominal velocity of 850 feet per second out of a 5-inch barrel. Those numbers need context. A modern .223 rifle round travels at around 3,200 feet per second. A 9mm parabellum, the cartridge the rest of the world was standardizing around, moves at roughly 1,150. The .45 ACP at 830 to 850 is subsonic. It doesn't break the sound barrier, and that, specifically, is the point. A heavy, slow, half-inch wide bullet doesn't accelerate through tissue. It displaces it. It carries energy deep and wide instead of dumping it shallowly. The distinction, wide and slow versus narrow and fast, became the central argument in military handgun design for the next 100 years. Zoom out for a second, because this is where the round stops being just a cartridge and becomes a kind of design philosophy. What stands out to me about the specification Thompson and Lagarde wrote is that it wasn't neutral. It was a bet that bullet diameter mattered more than velocity at the ranges a pistol actually operated at, and a bet that mass and momentum would solve a problem that no other variable had solved in the field. That bet was made against the weight of ballistic orthodoxy in most of Europe, which was moving toward faster, smaller rounds. The Americans went the other way. Whether that bet was correct is still argued. What I'd say is that for the specific problem the Army had just encountered, it was almost certainly the right call. For other problems, maybe not. I'll come back to that. The pistol Browning designed around the new cartridge was accepted into US service in 1911 after what had by then become the most exhaustive handgun evaluation the Army had ever conducted. The designation reflected nothing but the year of adoption, the M1911. Nobody in 1911 thought they were building a legend. They were solving a specific problem, the one encountered in the Philippine jungle, with a specific tool. They picked the tool that had worked. The First World War came and went. The M1911 saw service in the trenches, carried mostly by officers, tankers, pilots, and men in specialized roles. Most killing in that war was done by artillery, by machine guns, and by rifle fire at moderate distances. In the places where the fight closed to grenade-throwing range, the .45 started to earn a reputation, though the record from the Great War is thinner and more scattered than what would come later. American troops in the final offensives of 1918 used the pistol in cleared trenches and dugout rooms, at distances where a bolt-action rifle was useless. Nothing dramatic in the official record. Small, repeated notes about what the pistol did when it was what a soldier had. Then came the interwar years, and a detour. Somewhere in the early 1920s, John Thompson, the same Thompson from the 1904 tests, took the same cartridge and put it in a submachine gun, a portable shoulder-fired weapon capable of fully automatic fire, the first practical American submachine gun. He called it the trench broom. The Great War had ended before his company could sell one, so the Thompson submachine gun spent most of the 1920s looking for a customer. The customer it found wasn't the one Thompson had imagined. Prohibition America, Chicago in the late 1920s. The Thompson, nicknamed the Tommy gun almost immediately, was one of the few weapons on the civilian market that could produce large volumes of accurate close-range fire from a concealable package. Gangsters bought them, bank robbers bought them, police departments bought them in response. By 1929, when Al Capone's men allegedly used Thompsons in the St. Valentine's Day massacre, the weapon was fixed in American public memory as a criminal tool, which is a strange origin for what would become standard-issue infantry equipment a decade later. The company's finances didn't recover through that period. By 1938, there were still thousands of unsold Thompsons in a warehouse, and the firm had gone through restructuring. Then, Europe went to war. The British, fighting alone after Dunkirk and desperate for small arms of any kind, started ordering Thompsons by the tens of thousands. American production ramped up. The gun that had spent 2 decades looking for a purpose had one almost overnight. Once the United States entered the war after Pearl Harbor, the tactical implications of that production became specific. The Thompson on full automatic cycled at approximately 700 rounds per minute. In a 2-second burst, about the longest burst a trained soldier would attempt, the weapon could put roughly 20 rounds of .45 ACP into a doorway, a trench section, or a single room. The Germans had submachine guns too. Their doctrine for them was sophisticated. The MP-40, chambered in 9mm parabellum, was lighter, cheaper, and produced in enormous quantities. By any engineering standard, it was an excellent weapon. At close range, it wasn't doing the same work. The difference showed up in the records of the fighting after the Normandy landings in June 1944. American and Allied troops pushed inland from the beaches and immediately ran into a terrain problem no one had fully planned for: the bocage. Norman hedgerows, ancient, dense, interwoven walls of earth and vegetation built up over centuries as field boundaries. Engagement distances collapsed. Instead of hundreds of yards, American units were fighting at 10, sometimes less. Every pasture was a fortress. Every sunken lane was a killing ground. Rifle marksmanship was only half of what mattered in that country. The other half was what happened when a patrol turned a corner and a man was already there. In those encounters, the Thompson did what no other Allied weapon quite replicated. American paratroopers, rangers, and point men on patrol learned it under fire. And it wasn't just an American observation. British and Canadian troops operating alongside American units wrote down the same pattern. Thompson-armed scouts, Allied officers noted in after-action reports, produced results in ambush situations that comparable British units armed with Sten guns, firing the 9mm round, didn't match. The Sten was a good weapon, stamped, simple, cheap, produced by the million. It put rounds down range reliably. At close range, it wasn't doing the same thing. A careful note here: the Thompson versus Steen comparison is the kind of thing that can become folklore very quickly, and there are accounts from both sides of that comparison that probably reflect selection bias. A Thompson that worked well is not a memorable story. A Sten that jammed at a bad moment is. I wouldn't put too much weight on any individual account. What I think the pattern does show is the volume and independence of the observations. American sources, British sources, Canadian sources, different theaters, different unit types, with enough consistency that I'd call the pattern real even while being careful with any specific engagement. That pattern also appears in German records, but in distorted form. German after-action reports from 1944 and 1945 contain references to American Maschinengewehre, machine guns, encountered at specific hedgerows and in specific villages. Later intelligence work, cross-referencing captured documents against American unit tables, identified the problem. Some of those references weren't to machine guns at all. They were to Thompson submachine guns. The rate of fire and the visible, audible impact of the rounds, on men, on wood, on masonry, produced an impression from the receiving end of something heavier than a pistol cartridge. How much weight to put on that is a judgment call. Enemy reports misidentify weapons regularly in every war. That's just true. What the Maschinengewehr references confirm, at minimum, is that the Thompson's close-range output was hitting hard enough and fast enough that a trained soldier writing under pressure was reaching for the wrong word to describe it. That's not proof of anything about the .45 round specifically. It's suggestive. Treat it that way. While that was unfolding in France, the same cartridge was doing similar work on the other side of the world in a completely different kind of fight. The Pacific. The Pacific War is one of the strangest campaigns in military history. An ocean the size of half the planet. Island chains separated by hundreds of miles of open water. A Japanese opponent whose doctrine, organization, and, after 1943, specific tactical adjustments made the fighting on any given island distinct from almost anything else in the Second World War. And the United States Marine Corps, which had been the first American force issued the M1911 in the years before the Great War, and which had carried it through every small war, every Banana Republic intervention, and every peacekeeping deployment in the decades between. By 1942, the Corps' relationship with the 45 was older than most of the Marines carrying it. That relationship was tested first on Guadalcanal in August 1942. The 1st Marine Division landed in the Solomon Islands with orders to seize a Japanese airfield under construction. The landings themselves were almost unopposed. What came after was not. For 6 months, in conditions that amounted to a slow-motion disaster, malaria, dysentery, starvation rations, a supply line that came close to collapse, the Marines fought a campaign that defined the opening phase of the Pacific War. Japanese infantry doctrine in 1942 still favored mass attacks, night attacks, infiltration at close range. Against well-prepared Marine positions, that doctrine produced catastrophic casualties. At the Battle of the Tanaru in August, a Japanese force of roughly 900 men attempted a frontal attack against the 1st Marines, and most were killed for comparatively light Marine losses. But not every engagement on Guadalcanal was a frontal assault at a prepared line. Some happened in the jungle at night, at ranges where a man could reach out and touch you. Some happened when an infiltrator got through the wire and into a foxhole. Some happened when a Marine on sentry duty saw movement in the tree line and had seconds to decide what to do. In those moments, a sidearm mattered. The M1911A1, an updated version of the original design with a revised grip and sights, was standard issue for Marine officers and for crew-served weapon crews. Machine gunners, mortar crews, radio operators, men whose primary weapon was something other than a rifle. All of them carried pistols, and the accounts that came out of Guadalcanal and then out of Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliu, and Iwo Jima are consistent on a specific point. What the Marines remembered wasn't their marksmanship. It was what happened in the moment after the round hit. I want to qualify that right away, because there's an obvious problem with relying on combat memoirs. Not every Marine who fired his pistol hit what he was aiming at. Pistols are hard to shoot accurately under stress. The original sights on the 1911 were minimal, small notched bumps on the slide, and most Marines received limited pistol training before deployment. The weapon was heavy, just under 3 pounds loaded. The recoil was substantial. A lot of men who carried it through the whole war fired it in combat rarely, or not at all. So when we talk about the 45's reputation, we're talking about a subset of a subset, the men who actually used it in combat, and then the smaller group of those men who wrote about it afterward. That's not a random sample. It skews toward the dramatic. Any honest reading has to allow for that. Even with that caveat, the accounts cluster. Eugene Sledge, a mortarman with the 1st Marine Division, served through Peleliu and Okinawa. He carried a Colt new service revolver in .45 caliber, sent to him by his family. His memoir, among the best pieces of writing about infantry combat in any war, describes using that revolver in specific situations on Peleliu. at ranges where a carbine or a rifle wasn't an option. Sledge doesn't dramatize. His prose is measured. He's explicit about what the round did and about his trust in it. Peleliu is worth pausing on. It wasn't supposed to be a long battle. The commanding general of the 1st Marine Division predicted, before the landings in September 1944, that the island would be secured within 4 days. It took more than 2 months. The Japanese garrison had prepared differently for this one. They had built a system of caves, tunnels, and connected bunkers inside the coral ridges at the island's center. The feature the Marines called Bloody Nose Ridge, the Omerbrogol, was honeycombed with fighting positions that couldn't be seen from outside and couldn't easily be destroyed from outside either. Fighting on Peleliu moved, over time, from open-terrain engagements to something closer to slow industrial extraction. Marines advanced up a ridge, took fire from a cave mouth they couldn't locate, called in artillery, airstrikes, or a tank, moved closer, took more fire from a position they still couldn't see. Closer, closer, until eventually someone, a rifleman with a grenade, a flamethrower operator, a Marine with a pistol, was at the mouth of the cave itself. That's the distance at which the .45 earned its Pacific reputation. Not at 50 yards, not at 20, at the distance of a room. One account I've read, and I want to be straightforward because I've seen it attributed to more than one officer with variations in the number of rounds fired and the specific cave system, describes a Marine officer on Peleliu losing his carbine in a cave engagement. He drew his 1911, 4 rounds, at close range. The threat ended. He wrote afterward, explicitly, that he believed the carbine wouldn't have produced the same result. Whether the carbine assessment is ballistically accurate is a separate question. The belief itself was formed in a place that gave it weight. I can't put a name on the account with confidence. That's the honest thing to say. The attribution problem doesn't make the story false. It does mean it's better treated as illustrative than as documentary. Multiply that kind of moment by the thousands of Marines who carried 1911s through the island campaigns. Most of them never fired in anger. Some fired and missed. Some fired and hit, but the engagement continued for other reasons. And some fired at 5 feet in the dark, at a man already on top of them, and the round ended the fight. It's the last category the stories came from. It's also the last category that shaped how the Corps thought about the pistol for the next 70 years. The comparison with the M1 carbine is where I'd be most cautious. The M1 carbine, carried in the Pacific by officers and by crew-served weaponsmen as a lighter alternative to a full rifle, didn't carry the same reputation as the .45. The .30 carbine round was smaller and faster than the .45. On paper, it delivered more energy. In veteran accounts, it was criticized repeatedly, a round that hit and didn't always stop. Veterans described over and over moments when a carbine round had gone into an attacker and the attacker had kept coming. Enough of those moments accumulated that the carbine, despite being a good weapon for what it was, picked up a reputation that followed it through the rest of the war. What I think is going on with the carbine comparison is selection bias, mostly. A carbine that worked well isn't a memorable story. A carbine that failed at close range, at a moment that almost cost someone his life, is. That skews which accounts got written down and remembered. The criticism of the carbine is probably partially accurate. It wasn't designed for extreme close-range engagement against determined opponents, and it underperformed against that use case. But the gap between its reputation and the .45's reputation in the Pacific is probably wider than the actual ballistic gap. I don't know exactly how much wider. That kind of thing doesn't resolve cleanly even when you try to be careful with it. Something larger was shifting in those years, beyond the specifics of caves and pistols. By the middle of 1943, Japanese military doctrine was changing. The early war had been fought on the assumption that American and Allied forces could be broken by shock, by bayonet charges, by infiltration, by the willingness to close with the enemy regardless of cost. That doctrine had worked, sometimes, in China. Against better-equipped opponents, it produced casualty ratios that couldn't be sustained. Atu Saipan, the largest Banzai attack of the Pacific War, carried out on Saipan in July 1944, ended in near-complete destruction of the Japanese units involved for comparatively limited American losses. Japanese commanders at the senior level, the ones thinking in terms of long campaigns rather than individual engagements, adjusted. They changed the doctrine. By Peleliu, and especially by Iwo Jima and Okinawa, the standard Japanese approach was no longer the charge. It was the defense, the cave, the tunnel, the attritional fight conducted from prepared positions, intended to kill as many Americans as possible before the defenders themselves were killed. The new objective was no longer to win, it was to make winning costly. Here's where the .45 ACP enters enemy doctrine directly, and this part I'd underline. Captured Japanese tactical manuals from the later phases of the Pacific War include specific instructions for close-quarters engagement with American units. These aren't manuals about the M1 Garand or the Browning automatic rifle, both formidable weapons the Japanese respected. They deal specifically with American close-range automatic fire, with the tactical problem created when an American patrol closed to within 10 yards of a Japanese defensive position. The instructions are consistent. Avoid close engagement where possible. Disrupt from distance. Use mortars. Use infiltrators at night rather than direct assault in daylight. Don't assume that concealment provides protection at ranges below 20 yards. Many factors contributed to that shift. The Thompson was one. The Browning automatic rifle was one. The American willingness to commit suppressive fire at close range was one. The .45 ACP carried in the 1911, the Thompson and later the M3 grease gun was measurably part of what was being avoided. Not because the pistol round alone could decide a fight. It couldn't. But because the combination of the cartridge's immediate effect and the volume of fire an American squad could produce with it, at the distances where the Japanese most needed to close, made close engagement statistically costly. What this actually tells you about infantry combat in the Pacific, and this is the part I'd emphasize, is that you have to be careful about what kind of evidence you're weighing. Combat memoirs are one thing. Enemy after-action reports are another. Captured doctrinal manuals, written by professionals, distributed through institutional channels, meant to be used in training, are a different class of evidence entirely. An army doesn't rewrite its infantry doctrine in response to reputation. It rewrites it in response to outcomes. That the Japanese rewrote theirs, specifically around American close-range automatic fire, is probably the strongest single piece of evidence in this entire story. It doesn't prove any specific claim about the .45 ACP. It tells you that something real was happening at close range in American engagements, and that a professional military was willing to change its tactics around it. That matters more than anecdote. On the other side of the world, the Germans were adjusting too, not in the same way, and not for the same reasons. By the summer of 1944, after the Normandy campaign was underway, German after-action reports had developed a specific vocabulary for describing American assault tactics in close terrain. The bocage, the villages, the edge of farm fighting that characterized the advance through France. German analysts kept returning to a specific combination in American tactics: M1 Garand rifle fire at moderate distances, Thompson fire at close range, a willingness to close with positions that, against other opponents, might have been held longer. The Garand was a rifle German soldiers recognized as a problem. 8-round en-bloc clip, semi-automatic, accurate out to several hundred yards, fed by a simple system that was hard to jam. The German infantryman's Kar 98K was a bolt-action rifle, a good one, accurate. In a sustained fire exchange, one American Garand could put out more rounds than 3 Kar 98Ks. That was a known problem and an unsolved one by the end of the war. The Thompson was a different problem. In fights that required Germans to hold at very close distances, hedgerow corners, farmhouses, walled villages, the Thompson created a tactical dilemma. The MP40 could answer a Thompson at range, round for round. At the distances that mattered, the answer wasn't quite the same. I want to make a claim here and be direct about it. The .45 ACP, by itself, did not win any battle in the Second World War. No pistol cartridge does. The pistol has always been a secondary weapon, something you reach for when your rifle is empty, jammed, or somehow out of the fight. The war was decided by artillery, by air power, by tanks, by logistics, by whole economies and whole populations mobilized against each other. A man with a pistol is almost never the hinge on which a campaign turns, but in the specific moments when a man with a pistol was the thing that mattered, in the bunker, in the house, in the cave, in the trench corner where there was no room to bring a rifle to bear, the cartridge shaped what happened. Those moments, accumulating over 5 years of war on both sides of the world, produced a body of observation that neither the laboratory nor the after-action report has ever fully reconciled. The gap between the data and the testimony is the hardest part of this story to talk about, because I don't think it resolves cleanly, and anyone who tells you it does is skipping over something. Here's what the data says. Read honestly. A .45 ACP produces a wider permanent wound channel than a 9mm round at comparable ranges. That's measurable in ballistic gelatin. That's measurable in post-mortem examinations. The hole is bigger. The bullet, because it doesn't expand or fragment under normal military conditions, relies on mass and diameter to do its work, which is what it was designed for in 1904. The difference in immediate incapacitation rates, when actually measured under controlled conditions, is smaller than the combat accounts suggest. A 9mm round, well placed, will stop a fight. A .45 round, poorly placed, won't. Shot placement, where the bullet goes, matters more than caliber within the range of pistol calibers, almost every time. FBI research conducted in the 1980s and 1990s as American law enforcement agencies tried to settle the same argument for their own purposes, found that premium 9mm ammunition, particularly modern hollow point rounds that didn't exist during the war, could achieve wound track performance nearly identical to .45 ACP and .40 S&W. That research was one of the reasons American police agencies started transitioning back to 9mm in the 1990s and 2000s, after a brief period when many of them had moved to larger calibers. On the numbers alone, the .45's combat reputation should have been normalized by now. It hasn't been, at least not among the men who carried it. My honest read is this. I don't have a clean framework that makes both the data and the testimony true at the same time. They're probably measuring different things. The data measures tissue response under controlled conditions, and the testimony captures something about what happens when a human being, in a position of extreme stress, is hit hard enough and fast enough that the immediate response looks qualitatively different from other engagements that same man has been in. That's speculative. It's the best speculation I have. A second possibility, and I hold this one more loosely, is that part of the effect is psychological, and it works in both directions. The men firing the .45 expected it to work, and that expectation shaped how they pressed an engagement. The men receiving it had absorbed enough of its reputation, through prisoner accounts, through battlefield observation, through the visible results of earlier engagements, that fear preceded impact. In close combat, where fractions of a second decide outcomes, a man who hesitates has already conceded something. Reputation can function as its own category of terminal effect. By the middle years of the war, the .45's reputation had circulated widely enough that it arrived in any close-quarters fight ahead of the weapon itself. Whether that's a real effect or a storytelling effect is hard to pin down. Probably some of both. The post-war record is consistent with a narrow reading of the .45's effectiveness. The Korean War came just 5 years after the Second World War ended. Different terrain, different enemy. The 1911 and the Thompson were still in American service, though the Thompson was being supplemented and gradually replaced by the simpler M3 grease gun, lighter, cheaper, chambered in the same .45 ACP. American and Canadian accounts from Korea repeat a lot of the same observations. A retired officer who served in Korea and had access to both the 9mm Browning high power and the 1911 wrote that Canadian troops armed with 9mm pistols often traded for American .45s when they could get them. The exception, he noted, was when enemy troops were wearing heavy clothing or body armor, in which case the 9mm higher velocity gave better penetration. Against unarmored personnel, the preference stayed with the .45. That's not ballistics data. That's testimony. I'd take it seriously because it comes from men who used both tools in the same conditions, which is a rare class of evidence. I'd also qualify it because testimony is subject to the same survivor bias and selection problems that affect everything else we've been talking about. The combination of the testimony and the data, for me, points toward a narrow but real advantage for the .45 in the specific conditions it was designed for, and rough parity, or a 9mm advantage on capacity and penetration against clothing, in most other conditions. That's a boring conclusion. I think it's the correct one. By the 1960s and 1970s, the pressure on the 1911 was building. Part of it was about logistics. The United States was the only NATO member still carrying a .45 caliber service pistol, and the alliance had standardized on 9mm. Part of it was about the age of the weapons themselves. Most of the 1911s in American service had been manufactured during the Second World War, some of them earlier. After 40 years of hard use, many were worn. Slides and frames had loosened. Parts were harder to source. The gunsmiths who understood how to rebuild them were retiring. The platform was old, and even the men who loved it admitted that the guns in the armory were, in many cases, past their service life. In 1985, after a long and contested trials process, the Army adopted the Beretta 92FS as the M9, a 9mm double-stack high-capacity sidearm, standard NATO round, 15-round magazine instead of the 1911's 7. On paper, a modernization. In logistics, a simplification. In the specific application of close-range engagement against unarmored opponents, a trade. The transition wasn't popular with everyone. Some senior officers and veterans who had carried the 1911 in Vietnam made their objections known. Some were sentimental, some weren't. The Marine Corps, in particular, dragged its feet. While the Army and Air Force switched over in the late 1980s, the Marines kept the 1911 in service for specific units for decades longer. Force Recon, MEU Special Operations Capable Units, the predecessors of what became MARSOC. In 1985, a Marine Corps colonel named Robert Young laid out a series of specifications to bring the 1911 up to modern standards. New sights, new safeties, tighter tolerances. Marine armorers at the Precision Weapons section in Quantico started hand-building custom 1911s for special operations units. The pistols they built became known informally as the MUSOC pistols, officially the M45. They stayed in service from 1985 until 2012, when the Corps contracted with Colt for a new factory-built variant called the M45A1C-QBP, Close Quarters Battle Pistol. A modernized 1911 with dual recoil springs, tritium night sights, ambidextrous safeties, and a desert tan finish. The M45A1 was eventually retired in 2022 when the Marines transitioned to the M18, a 9mm variant of the Sig Sauer P320. That formally ended the M1911's service life in the United States military, more than 110 years after its adoption. The stretch between 1985 and 2022 is the part I find hardest to dismiss. For 37 years after the Army officially replaced the 1911, Marine operators continued carrying it, or explicit descendants of it, into specialized close-quarters missions. Those operators weren't a group I'd describe as sentimental. They were people whose job was to select the right tool for the specific mission and who had the institutional authority to keep the tool they wanted. The men in Force Recon and MARSOC selecting weapons for direct action missions aren't the population most prone to nostalgia, that they kept coming back to the .45 through multiple contracts across multiple generations of operators after every ballistic study that said the 9mm was functionally equivalent had been published and discussed, is a data point. It's not proof. It's not nothing either. I don't want to oversell this. By 2016, MARSOC had already begun moving to the Glock 19 in 9mm, largely for logistical compatibility with other SOCOM units. The shift wasn't about performance, according to the Marine Corps' own statements, but a pure performance argument against the .45 would have driven that shift much earlier than it did. The fact that it took that long and that Marine Systems Command was still buying new factory 1911s as recently as 2012 tells you something about institutional preference that you don't see in the raw ballistic numbers. That's the trade. A broader frame is worth placing on all of this. The decades between 1904 and 1945 were a period of enormous change in how nations thought about violence. The Philippines campaign happened in a world where colonial wars were a routine feature of great power politics. By the time the Second World War ended, that world was gone. The Philippines would become independent. The British Empire would begin to dissolve. The Japanese Empire would be dismantled. The International Order of 1945 barely resembled the one of 1899. The cartridge we've been talking about rode through all of it, designed for one kind of war, in one kind of place, against one kind of enemy. Carried into wars nobody imagined in 1904. Good tools tend to outlive the problems they were designed for. The men who use them carry the memory of what they were designed for into contexts where the original problem doesn't strictly apply anymore. That's how reputations form. That's how traditions form. In some cases, that's how entire doctrines form. The .45 ACP's reputation in the Second World War was built on something real. A real ballistic effect at short range against unarmored opponents. A real tactical edge in terrain where close engagement was unavoidable. A real documented pattern of outcomes on both sides of two different oceans. It was also built on something the data never quite captured. The expectation the round carried with it, and the way that expectation shaped the behavior of the men firing it and the men being fired at. The record of those moments isn't mythology. It's the primary source accounts of men who were there, on both sides, writing under conditions that gave their writing weight. Captured documents, interrogation reports, tactical manuals written by an enemy army trying to explain what was going wrong at close range in the bocage. Another enemy army changing its infantry doctrine on a Pacific island in response to something that wasn't the rifle and wasn't the machine gun. The laboratory can't fully account for that. The after-action report can't fully account for it either. What we have is an accumulation of consistent observations over decades from sources that had no reason to coordinate and no reason to lie. If I had to state what I actually believe about this, clear of storytelling, it would be this. The .45 ACP was a cartridge optimized for a specific problem: close-range, unarmored, determined opponents. And for that problem, it was probably the best pistol round adopted by any military in the first half of the 20th century. Outside that problem, it was adequate, but not special. The arguments for moving to 9mm are arguments I don't have a strong counter to. The reason the round's reputation persisted past its practical usefulness is a combination of institutional memory, genuine effectiveness in a narrow set of conditions, and the psychological effect a well-established weapon has on both the user and the target. I don't think any of those three components by itself explains the pattern. I think all three together do. The men who carried the 1911 through the Second World War are almost all gone. The last of them are in their late 90s or older. The pistols they carried are in museums, in private collections, and in armories that are unlikely to see another issue order. The cartridge remains in production. A box of .45 ACP can be bought at any sporting goods store in the United States. It looks almost exactly like the cartridge a Marine carried ashore on Guadalcanal in 1942, because in all the ways that matter, it is the same cartridge, same weight, same diameter, same velocity. 120 years after Thompson and Lagarde strung up cadavers in a Chicago slaughterhouse, the specification they wrote hasn't been materially changed. Something happened at close range, in American engagements, in the Second World War, that ballistics alone can't fully explain. The cartridge most responsible was a pistol round designed decades earlier for a colonial war most Americans have now forgotten. The gap between what the numbers say and what the men who were there believed is not a gap I can close. I don't think anyone can. What I can do is point to it, describe it as carefully as I can, and say that the evidence, enemy doctrine, independent testimony, institutional retention, is the kind of evidence that deserves to be taken seriously, even when it doesn't add up cleanly. That's the story of the 45, as best as I can tell it. If you've found it worth sitting with, there's more I'm working on in the same direction: cartridges, doctrines, and decisions that shaped how the 20th century was actually fought, pulled out of the record rather than out of the folklore. You know where the button is. You know where the button is. You know where the button is. You know where the button is.